Hey guys, Ron here. Oh boy, that shirt is very colorful, isn't it? This jacket. It's a San Francisco. I know it's backwards here, but listen to those guys. It's appropriate I'm wearing this. I might have even bought this jacket on Pier 39, where in San Francisco, where you basically have to line up with like 100 people and stand on these bleachers they have set aside and watch these guys that I can watch here for free that come to the harbor there at Pier 39. Or here I got them every night for free. So it's odd that I'm wearing the San Francisco jacket. I might have bought it. What does it mean? What does it mean? Let's turn around. Let's take a look. Oh, that guy's just sleeping. All right, so folks, tonight I'm going to talk about Titanic, RMS Titanic. The short life and death of Titanic sinking on her maiden voyage is so fascinating to so many of us because it wasn't just a disaster. It wasn't just a ship sinking. It wasn't just a ship sinking. Costa Concordia. It is much more significant. It's legendary in history. It's an iconic moment in history, the sinking of Titanic, because it represented the death, so many say, the symbolic death of what came to be known as the Gilded Age, the Golden Age, the age in which there was so much feelings of indestructibility. There were so many wealthy people, and there was so much wealth in the country and in England at that time, and so many wealthy passengers on Titanic. And White Star Line, owned by John Pierpont Morgan, better known as J.P. Morgan. And then it all came to a symbolic end that night in April 1912 when the ship sunk, and things were really never the same. And then just 2 years later, at least in Europe and in here, World War I started, and that was another era come to a close. And then, excuse me, the beginning of another era. So Titanic really symbolized the end of the Gilded Age and the beginning of the industrialization of America and Europe, of the very beginnings of America becoming a superpower, the superpower. We certainly were 20 years later, or 25 years later after the end of World War II. But this was the beginning of it. So what I want to talk about specifically today, among the boats here, which is also kind of appropriate, is the what ifs with Titanic. There were things that if they were tweaked a little, things might have ended differently. And it just goes to show that it seems that fate is fate, that what was meant to be that night for some reason was meant to be. Because like I said, there are some things I'll discuss which you may not know about, which if done differently, or if circumstances were different, it might have averted disaster. For some reason, I don't know why, and this has happened to me before, I started getting, I don't remember what the circumstances was, whether I saw something on TV or read a book or what it was, but around 1995, I started getting immensely interested in Titanic. And I could sense immediately, like I say, it wasn't just the sinking of a ship, a disaster. It was the end of an era. It was iconic moment, and I understood that when I first started studying it, because it was so unbelievable that it could happen. So for some reason, like I said, in '95, I started studying it and getting into it and obsessing about it, as I do about things, and reading a couple of books about it that I got. And then I heard that production was, they were doing production on the movie Titanic, and I heard that the male protagonist's name was going to be Jack, and I thought, oh, maybe it's Jack Phillips. And I thought, wait a minute, he was just the radio operator. I don't think they build the film around Jack Phillips. But that's where my mind was at the time, and I was very excited. And as you know or don't know, the film Titanic was, other than the fictionalized love story and love triangle, which was a great plot device used by Jim Cameron, the portrayal of the sinking of Titanic was in real time. and was an excellent film. And the film could be viewed almost as a documentary, even though it is fiction. But there are lots of documentaries out there and lots of books about Titanic and why it holds such a special place in history. But essentially, sorry, I just stepped through a huge puddle. We just had major rains here again. Um, Titanic was born of English shipmakers called White Star Line. And White Star, I believe they started in the 1840s, and they were competing heavily with Cunard, the other great ocean line company in England. And Cunard ships ended with A: Lusitania, Mauretania. White Stars ended with IC: Titanic, Olympic. It was going to be Britannic. And Harland and Wolff, in the around 1902, I believe, became the builders in Belfast, Ireland, employed by White Star Line to build their ships. And they built Titanic in Belfast, primarily. Titanic was the largest ship in the world. It was literally the biggest thing, the biggest man-made object in the world. And it launched out of Southampton on its maiden voyage in mid-April of 1912, and it had over 2,000 people aboard, between crew and passengers. And like I say, there was J.P. Morgan, the owner. And it's interesting because J.P. Morgan, essentially the owner of White Star Line, was supposed to be on that maiden voyage, and I believe he begged off sick, which is very fortunate for him, because he probably would be dead. He never would have made it into a lifeboat. But Benjamin Guggenheim was there on Titanic, and John Jacob Astor. So these millionaires and billionaires, millionaires at the time, were on board. It was the thing to do. In fact, the most, you're not going to believe this, but the most palatial suites on Titanic rented for a price that today would be the equivalent of, get this, $122,000 a night. It's just unbelievable. The luxury was unbelievable. And yes, it did have steerage and third class, as portrayed in the movie Titanic. A lot of immigrants coming over to America from third class. But I must say that the third class, the steerage on Titanic, was better than other ships, and actually the food and the accommodations that the passengers in steerage got was actually a lot better than they had in their home life and whatever they were leaving. So it wasn't quite as bad as portrayed. It wasn't coffin ships like the ships that used to come over from Ireland after the potato famines, where people actually died on the ships because they were so unhealthy. The unhealthy conditions, that is. So anyway, Titanic, largest ship in the world. It sets sail from Southampton, England. It makes a stop. Actually, when it was leaving Southampton Harbor, it clipped another ship, and had to be assisted by a tugboat, actually. And it actually, did not make contact, but it was pretty hairy situation, and some see it as foreboding of the disaster that was going to happen, foreshadowing. And it left Southampton Harbor and went to Cherbourg, France, took on some more passengers, and went to Ireland and took on some passengers, and it was on its way in the North Atlantic. Now, this was April. Bruce Ismay, J. Bruce Ismay, the president of White Star Line, it had been in his family, he was on board to oversee the maiden voyage. Now, this was going to be Captain Smith's last voyage, and this was going to be his retirement. He was about 63 years old, and this was going to be it for him. So he and Bruce Ismay, the plan was they really wanted to set a speed record and get into New York a little bit early. However, there's some misconceptions that this might have had something to do indirectly with the accident that happened, but I don't really think it had a lot to do with it. All we know is that 4 nights out, as most of us already know, Titanic strikes an iceberg. Well, let's talk about the conditions. Um, you can see me. I'm in a ghostly view. So the what ifs start early on. First of all, there had been 6 warnings from other ships regarding icebergs, and an unusual amount of icebergs for springtime, even for the North Atlantic. So Captain Smith did eventually alter course and go further south. This isn't always portrayed accurately. It wasn't like Smith was completely controlled by Ismay, the president of his boss, the president of White Star Lines. Forge ahead, faster, faster, faster. Don't deviate. That wasn't exactly true. Smith did take the ship further south to try to avoid the icebergs, but they were everywhere. In fact, the Californian, who played a large part in what happened or what didn't happen later, had radio that they were actually going to stop for the night. They were kind of stuck in the midst of a lot of icebergs, and that warning, among other warnings, did not get through to Captain Smith. As a matter of fact, start with the what ifs. So like I said, there were 6 warnings at least. Captain Smith did alter the course of Titanic to try to avoid these icebergs in the North Atlantic there. But the radio operator, Jack Phillips, aboard Titanic with the wireless, the Marconi, the wireless, had been talking to other ships. Now, there was a backlog because of some equipment malfunction. So Phillips, in his haste, was trying to get out all these telegrams, he was working his wireless, try to get out all these messages on his wireless from passengers to, I don't know, I guess people, friends and relatives in America and in England, I suppose, beep, 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 Morse code. I don't know what they're saying. Having a great time, 3rd day aboard ship, see you in New York soon. Can't wait till you meet us. I don't know. But Phillips was so overwhelmed with getting these, because there had been a backup, this backlog of messages. He was so consumed with that when Californian their radio operator was telling Phillips, trying to issue even greater, stronger warnings about all the icebergs that they were in close by, Phillips literally said, shut up, I'm working, I've got stuff to do, I'm switched off. Now that will become crucial, because later Californian was the closest ship, and if they would have been in contact, still radio contact with Titanic, despite seeing flares, they might have gotten there sooner than the only ship who did appear in a relatively quick amount of time, which was 4 hours, which was Carpathia, the ship that eventually came as dawn was breaking around 6:30 in the morning and saved the 700 passengers that were in lifeboats. So we know again that Titanic struck an iceberg. Well, despite all these warnings, like I say, one of the what ifs was that it was a moonless night. And because it was a moonless night, couldn't see what was happening. Now, there's some around them. There's some discussion over what happened to the binoculars. Now, I have heard only recently that Captain Smith actually fired a crewman, presumably in Southampton, before they took off, and that crewman, in his anger and his haste, took his glasses, the binoculars, with him. And apparently those were the only ones. Had there been binoculars up at the crow's nest, and then the crewman in the crow's nest might have seen the iceberg before Titanic was right on top of it, and disaster might have been averted. So that's what. Now, there are other theories about just the glasses were misplaced, nobody could find them, but one pair of binoculars might have saved the lives of over 1,500 people and the ship. So it's a clear moonless night, and also the sea was a flat calm, like a pond. No ripples at all. Now, that's significant, and also it was later discovered that the reason for that flat calm, possibly part of it was icebergs. Evidently, when there's a prevalence of icebergs, it causes the ocean to be a flat calm like that. That I did not know, but I just read that. So anyway, it was a flat calm. If it had it not been a flat calm, had there been ripples on the ocean, the guys in the crow's nest quite probably would have seen the ripples of the water hitting the iceberg and bumping up against it and causing that ripple. And there you go. There's another what if. But because it was so dark and because it was such a flat calm, they could not see. Now, not only that, but apparently the iceberg that was the infamous iceberg that Titanic struck was a bluish hue, a bluish shade in color. It wasn't pure white, which would have been easier to see. Some of these bergs were bluish in color. And it's interesting because there is a photo, there's actually a series of photos, but there is a pretty good close-size photo. And remember, folks, this was 1912. Even in the American Civil War in the 1860s, they had some great photographs. So by 1912, photography was not in its infancy. They had some pretty good photographs. So there is some pretty good photographs of an iceberg that is believed to be the one that Titanic struck. Of course, today, scientists would probably be able to fly right out to it and investigate it further by helicopter, by ship, submersibles. But apparently, witnesses who photographed it said that, and you can look at the photographs of it, say that it had a red streak, which they believe to be paint off Titanic's hull. Really, really freaky. So Titanic strikes this iceberg, which the guys on the crow's nest did not see till they were right on top of it. They literally called down, and it was, "What do you see? Iceberg dead ahead. Thank you." And that was it. And the officer on the deck called to do a port around, which essentially meant they were going to turn one way and then kind of turn the other way and try to whip around it. So not only does the bow not come in contact with the berg, but the thought was they could avoid the stern being hit as well. So kind of a zigzag around the berg. Now, to do that, the ship, I believe it was Officer Lightoller, to do that, he ordered the ship to not only turn, obviously, to avoid hitting the berg head on, but to stop engines. Now, it's been said during the investigation, by the way, there were investigations held in England and in the United States after the Titanic disaster. And there's, lots of records on who was interviewed and what was said, and it was like the equivalent of a congressional investigation. Excuse me. But it is said that had he not ordered a stop of the engines, which, by the way, never had time to stop. They portrayed that in the movie Titanic with the engine starting to go to reverse. But the engineer testified in England, I believe, that it struck so fast they didn't even have time to stop. But if he had kept the engines going forward, that it is said that they probably would have avoided the berg by just even several feet. Now, so another what if, had the engines up and down. Now, here's another what if. If they had struck that iceberg head on like they were about to do, because of the angle they were at, or not, the ship probably would have been crippled, the bow would have been damaged, and they would have waited for repairs and rescue. But had they hit head on, they would not have sunk. So it was that effort to avoid hitting the iceberg, turning, and just clipping it on its turn that sunk the berg and killed all those people. Another what if. But they were hoping they could avoid it. Now, as I said, Californian was so rudely yelled at, the wireless guy was so rudely yelled at by Jack Phillips, the wireless Marconi operator aboard Titanic. Shut up, I'm busy. I'm sending, from messages from the pastors that they did not receive, or claim they did not receive the SOS, what was called the warnings, the wireless warnings about the tragedy. So QD in those days. So California, which was the closest ship, was not able to respond. A couple of other ships were aware, but they were several hours out. In fact, one would have not arrived for about 24 hours. It was so far away. The only ship that was close enough at all was a ship called Carpathia. And actually, Carpathia and the captain of Carpathia went down as heroes in history because they did arrive, as portrayed again in the film Titanic. They arrived early the next morning, and they picked up everyone in the lifeboats. And, the rule was if you're a guy, you're screwed. It was women and children first into lifeboats, and that was it. Now, as we know, Bruce Ismay, the president of, of course, all the things are portrayed in the film. Bruce Ismay, president of Titanic, he did worm his way, and I won't make a judgment. He did make his way into a lifeboat and survive, and he did testify at both the hearings in England and the United States. But he became a recluse for quite a while. He was looked on as a coward that should have gone down with the ship. But he didn't, and he survived. Now, Captain Smith, no one knows what happened to Captain Smith. In the film, I believe it's portrayed he's standing on the bridge and water breaches the bridge and flood comes in and he's just gone. Right after it happened, there were stories that he was rescuing a baby, and as he went to rescue the baby, he was swept out to sea. No one knows what happened to Captain Edward Smith. But it was his last voyage. That's just not the way he intended. But he did not survive. A lot of officers, a lot of crew did survive, though. Not all, but the crew that were manning the lifeboat survived. And we know what else happened. A lot of lifeboats went out half full. There weren't enough lifeboats to start with. This was an act that was considered inconceivable. Here's another what if now that I think about it. After from 1912 to essentially 1985 or 86 was it, when Titanic was discovered by Dr. Robert Ballard. Robert D. Ballard, as one of the survivors used to call him. She was, I think, 4 months old at the time of the sinking. Until Robert Ballard discovered Titanic in 85, it was thought that the iceberg cut sort of like a can opener scratch in Titanic, that the iceberg, and that had caused the 6 compartments to flood, therefore sinking the ship. But it really wasn't. It was more like pinpricks, and this caused the rivets to give way. And it was later discovered that those rivets were not the highest quality rivets that could have been used. So that's another thing. If higher quality rivets had been used, maybe they wouldn't have all burst. Maybe 6 water tightening compartments wouldn't have flooded. And if only 1 to 4 of the compartments flooded, ship would have stayed afloat until help had come and probably wouldn't have sunk. So another what if. An endless series of what ifs when it comes to Titanic. But I guess it was just one of those things that was meant to be. The band did stay on. The band played on until they quit and went down with the ship. And these wealthy millionaires did stay aboard and died as gentlemen, as they said, and went down with the ship. Captain Smith, obviously, as I said, most of the officers. And it was really a terrible tragedy. And like I said, the end of the Gilded Age. And as far as canard lines, Lusitania shot down by a U-boat. England's entry into World War I with Germany. It was just a really fascinating time. What's going on here? El Torito. Going the wrong way, that's why. So like I said, it's a fascinating story. Titanic, not just the people who were on board, but the people who died, who witnessed what happened. Like I said, the last surviving passenger was a woman named Milvina Dean. She was always interviewed. I believe she died in the early 2000s. She was about 4 months old when she was aboard Titanic. Her father died aboard. I believe her mother survived and had her in her. I believe her mother had her in her arms on the lifeboat. So fascinating stories. You know, like I said, what's so fascinating to me, it really represents the symbolic end of the Gilded Age, and a new era in American and a new era in American history and English history, for that Americans. I mean, there were many American passengers as well as British passengers. Some people were going back to America from being on holiday in England, and some were coming from England to America and from other countries, especially in steerage. All right, folks, so that's the fascinating story of the what ifs that might have averted disaster with Titanic. My name is Ron. Wow, this is a long one. Thanks for hanging in there. Look at these behind me here. These are great, these trees. Thanks for hanging in there. If you like the channel, I'm cold, but I'm doing it for all of you. So please do subscribe, folks, if you haven't already. And if you do subscribe, hit the little bell icon next to the subscription button so you're alerted when I post. Give the channel likes, and I will see you all at the next location. Thanks. See you. Bye.